the whole topic of Gar's archives is very interesting, especially when it's a transient archives of the stores. Makes you want to, program a crawler that transgressively just goes out and archives the ones that say don't archive.
Yeah,
So.
yeah, make a shadow archive.
Yeah. Vera had a question.
Yeah, I was wondering, I know that I got the impression from people saying that some of the work you're doing right now involves interviews, right? You're doing some interviews with people. And I wondered if you might comment on how those kinds of methods intersect with this kind of thing. For example, when I know some of the people who's friends with Brad of Bradlands, who died relatively recently, actually. But so that means that I'm aware of the fact that there's all of these private archives that people have, right? So when somebody dies, for instance, there's this huge online fluster that happens. And people say, oh, do you have cached versions of this? We have to preserve this, and the domain will be lost, and so on. And people have a lot of this sort of stuff, and also, access to some of the sorts of things that aren't preserved through the Wayback Machine if something is heavy on scripting or with a web app or something like that. Somebody may have it on a hard drive somewhere and remember how it worked and be able to provide that, all these other degrees of thick description, essentially, for what you can get with these tools. And I wonder if you have any examples of your group doing intersections of this, or if your research is merging these different ways to get at the information.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's definitely something that, maybe not so explicitly, but that is definitely something I'm in the process of kind of trying to figure out, I guess. And I don't know if I have very specific examples other than, ultimately, they can complement each other through, in really weird ways probably too. I think at some point whenever I start interviewing, I'm probably going to interview some of these bloggers. Showing them this stuff might actually, make a connection, or like it becomes material in some way. But I don't know. I am currently kind of involved in getting. Currently studying Hotwired, which is like the first Wired site, which a lot of these bloggers kind of worked there before they started their blogs. And so I'm getting this can I brag a little bit about my data? But I'm getting this collection of all these emails from the Wired mailing list in the early years. And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see, because the first thing I'm going to do with that is take it to Eric, who's our lead programmer, and say, what can we do with this, from the very basic, let's make it searchable, to, let's think about how we can split it up and kind of categorize and do all these different things with it. So I would say that hopefully there are some productive ways of kind of finding, having them complement one another. But I wouldn't say that I have really specific examples.
And it opens up a bottomless pit, too. You can feel like you've exhaustively looked at what the Wayback Machine gives you, but once you open up the possibility of tracking down every single person who's still around and asking them in detail about what was really happening, it becomes really overwhelming.
Oh, absolutely. But I would say that is one of the very immediate uses of it, of saying, okay, so within that network, this blog was quite important. I hadn't heard of it, so I'm going to go. It does kind of maybe lead you.
Focus.
Yeah.
Just to follow up on that question, it just occurs to me that wonderful thing for the BMI group would be, after so many years of projects, just to have a timed interval for kind of a meta critique or meta reflection on one's project. The big question is, here are the methods that we've been using. What kinds of biases are they introducing in our understanding of web culture, simply because we're using those methods? And the reason we're using those methods is that they're usable, as opposed to others that are not usable.
Yeah, absolutely. Even this talk, just being able to step back just a little bit, was already. I was like, oh wow, this is how I should, this is how I could think about what we're doing. But I mean, something like that would be necessary. I think. I mean, at some point, definitely. I would recommend. I'd recommend a lot of Richard's work if you're interested in this. Richard Rogers, he's got a book, Information Politics on the Web, which kind of is again kind of proto-digital methods from a little bit earlier. And he's got, obviously, we've got the Digital Methods Wiki, and he's written kind of a lecture, or there's a published lecture on digital methods. But there's also one piece that comes to mind when you mention this, and that's a piece that he did. It's called The Politics of Web Space, and it's kind of a retrospective of kind of 10 years of web research using digital tools. So particularly about the issue crawler, and that's where I think he's definitely trying to historicize method there.
What's the
politics of web space. Yeah.
I wonder if archiving techniques or methods are going to change when our IP addresses exponentially increase.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Lisa Jeffbrat's one-to-one project. You probably know it, where she would ping. I think the time span was something like 96 to 99 or 95 to 99. So pinged the addresses, color-coded something like your blog key, personal, social. Those weren't her categories, but roughly equivalent. And then what you saw in the two maps was the blacking out of military sites. Essentially, that was the big lesson. Right? So I'm trying to think of what a project like that was going to look like when we're up to 6. There's individual numbers in our IP addresses. In other words, when the scale radically changes. I'm wondering if there's any thinking in your group about scale. Even as the scale is certainly vast now, it's going to change pretty dramatically.
Yeah. So you jogged my memory there. Her project, I've forgotten her name, but that came up when we did a project together. It was in 2008 at the summer school, and Alex Galloway was over doing, and he led one of our project groups called Alternative Algorithms, and we came up with something called the IP browser. So I would definitely suggest looking that one up. It is basically what he called kind of an exploration of the number space, and it's a pretty, I mean, it's definitely more of an art piece than a research piece, but it is quite neat because it does kind of expose you to some of that scale in a really weird way, because actually what you realize with the IP browser is that like 99.9% of the web is on all these virtual IP numbers, right? So within. And so you just kind of, you get this sort of feeling of sort of like that blacked out space, not necessarily military, but sort of that sort of kind of empty, like.
The problem gets even bigger when you think about the real time and streaming media that's going on, or quick time, tweets and so on.
Right. That's the other thing, of course. I mean, commercial data sets and walled gardens and how these are being excluded.
Michael, can I ask you this about the various outputs you described in the project? There are many visualizations, there are social network diagrams, there are, looking at some of the DMI tool sets, there are word collocation lists and so on. As you scale things up, we already began to see these in some of the issue crawler diagrams and so on. You showed high density of information, high density of nodes, links between them, to the point where it raises the question, how do you learn anything from that and then tell someone about that?
Yeah.
Don't you need a kind of a second layer of methods that are devoted to taking the results of a first-order visualization with high density and applying certain kinds of heuristics to make sense of it? Otherwise, you're left with a kind of a random image map of what's happening.
No, absolutely, and I think heuristic is definitely the right word, because what Richard is always going on about with us is like, okay, you've got that diagram, but what's the story?